Hi, everyone, and welcome to Module 3. Now, when people imagine the correctional process, they typically will think about the moment that offender gets released from prison as the end of the story, right? Sentence has been served, prison gates are open. I mean, have we even seen movies where like the offender walks out and it's like, ta-da, problem solved, right? But for most offenders, release is not the end of the correctional experience. And in many ways, it's the beginning of a new set of challenges. So this week, we're going to be talking about community corrections and the reentry process. So the process of returning to society after involvement with the criminal justice system. Now, to begin with, I want you to think about this. I want you to put yourself in your offender's shoes. So imagine that you spent months, maybe years, maybe even decades in a correctional institution, and you've lived according to someone else's schedule, right? You've had limited control over your daily life. Over that time, your relationships have changed. Maybe some relationships have disappeared entirely. And so let's say tomorrow you're getting out. Well, now you have a bunch of questions, right? Where are you going to live? Who's going to pick you up from prison? Do you have a job that you can go back to? Do you have a license to do that job if you don't have a specific job? Do you have any money to spend while you look for a job? Do you have transportation to go on job searches? Do you have health insurance because maybe you don't have a job? Is your family still in the picture, and are they willing to support you? And sometimes, especially with offenders that have been away for a while, do you even know how much the world has changed since you were gone? So for example, an offender who's been in a long time, when they get out, do they know how to use all the phone apps, right? Like say you've been in 20 years, when you went in, iPhone was in like an iPhone 2 generation, and now we come out and the whole world is smartphone, everything, and tablets and recording glasses and things like that you had no idea about when you were in, before you went inside, right? So for many people, these questions are not hypothetical. They are realities of leaving prison. One of the biggest misconceptions about reentry in the broader world is the idea that if you come out of prison, you just go back to your life and you start over, right? But in reality, and I'm sure as CJ students, you know, incarceration will typically disrupt nearly every major social institution that has shaped your life. It disrupts employment. It disrupts housing. It disrupts family relationships, your educational process, your healthcare access. And a lot of offenders are going to leave prison with significant disadvantages in each of those areas. So researchers often describe reentry as a process of social integration, because really the reentry part is about rebuilding all of those social institutions, rebuilding the relationships with those social institutions and those people to help individuals function successfully in society. Now, that doesn't mean that offenders are powerless, that successful reentry is impossible. Many people do successfully rebuild their lives after incarceration, but research shows us that reentry outcomes are influenced not just by individual motivation, but by a lot of structural and institutional factors. And that's where community corrections enters the conversation. Things like probation, parole, electronic monitoring, treatment programs, halfway houses, and specialty courts all exist because policy makers recognize that incarceration alone does not prepare people for successful reintegration. And so these were programs that we put in place to kind of help ease people back into society. Now, in theory, community corrections attempts to balance accountability with support, right? So offenders are expected to follow rules and they have to comply with supervision requirements, that accountability component. But at the same time, there's a lot more support: treatment services, employment services, housing support, counseling, educational classes, job skill training, etc. But now, once again, that brings us to an important question. What's the primary purpose of community supervision? Is it surveillance? Is it punishment? Does it go back to just retribution? Or is it rehabilitation? Is it public safety? Because that's a little bit different. Is the focus on the community and not necessarily the offender? And again, the answer, none of these is the the right answer, right? The reality is that most supervision models will emphasize a combination of the two. You might see some programs for reentry that are more emphasizing the monitoring and enforcement capabilities. Some are going to emphasize treatment and support. And most of them are going to try to do both simultaneously. And of course, that can be a real big challenge. So for example, let's think about an offender with substance abuse, right? So a treatment-oriented approach would focus on counseling and recovery services. And one of the things that we know from the literature is that if you're dealing with substance abuse, chances are you're not just going to quit tomorrow. You're going to try to quit, and then you're going to relapse, and you're going to have a problem, and then you're going to try to quit again, and then you're going to potentially have a relapse, maybe go longer this time. But you're going to have a series of relapses, right? We don't expect most people to be able to cut off whatever their substance is cold turkey and be successful. But if we allow for relapses, that flies counter in the face of a surveillance-oriented approach, because that's going to really focus on sanctions and drug testing and rule enforcement. So when we take an offender that is dealing with a substance abuse issue and we put them out in the community and we say, hey, one bad drug test, one screwed up appointment, and that's it, you're back to prison. It makes sense why we would do that to an offender in order to support their long-term success. But it also creates a challenge, because if we're using a treatment approach, we want to allow them to have those relapses without this one strike policy. So it's important to keep in mind, neither of these approaches is necessarily wrong, but they do reflect different assumptions about what supervision is intended to accomplish. And like we talked about in Module 1, there's probably going to be offenders that work better under the enforcement model and some that work better under the treatment model. Now, another thing we're talking about this week with reentry is collateral consequences. So collateral consequences are indirect penalties that are associated with criminal convictions, but that aren't actually imposed by a judge. These are things that emerge naturally through policies, regulations, and social reactions. And while some collateral consequences are intended, there are also a lot of unintended collateral consequences. That's where a large majority of my research has been, in the unintended collateral consequences of our sex offender policies. So we put in place good policies for public safety, but they've had unintended consequences. And so sometimes it's just understanding the consequences. Sometimes we want to mitigate those consequences in some way. Sometimes we acknowledge that they happen and that's the end of it. But it's important to know, right? So for example, criminal records are a big thing, right? Because we want to have public criminal records because we want offenders to have accountability. If I've stolen thousands of dollars from someone before, they want to make sure, like society wants to make sure, that when I interact with people in the future, that they know I've done all this with the finances. And so I'm not just handed somebody else's money and then I can steal from them again. But at the same time, if I do have a criminal record and it is public or available to others, then that becomes a challenge for me to find employment. It may affect where I can live or where I can go to school. It may affect what kind of professional licenses I get. Like, you can't pass the bar with certain criminal convictions. You can't work in a daycare with certain criminal convictions. And it can alter my family relationships, right? So if I'm a registered sex offender, for example, there are going to be people that are hesitant to be close with me just because of that label. And so it's something that policymakers really have to think about when they're putting in place new programs or policies, new punishments. Because if we think about the purpose of corrections being rehabilitation and successful reintegration, which again, not everybody views the purpose of corrections as this, but if you go with the Corrections Institute as a rehabilitation and correctional institution, then we have to think about what are those barriers to reintegration and how can we make reintegration easier to achieve. And so when you go through this week's material, I want you to really think about, what does reentry look like for your offender? What kind of risk needs does your offender have that will change what kind of supports they need when they get back into society? Remember also that reentry is not simply about whether someone commits another crime. Reoffense is always a big deal, right? If we put someone, if they go out of prison, they leave and they commit another crime, that's a problem. But we also are really interested in other outcomes. If we put someone in prison, they come out, we want to know, can they find stable housing? Can they maintain employment? Can they access treatment and healthcare going forward? Can they reintegrate back into society in a social manner? Can they develop that sense of belonging with their community in a way that hopefully makes them not want to commit offenses again? These questions are every bit as important as whether or not they're just rearrested. But something you'll see in the literature a lot is we just use rearrest because it's an easy indicator. But it's important to understand the other implications as well. So as you complete this week's reading, I encourage you to think critically about the barriers and the opportunities that exist within community corrections and the reentry systems. Ask yourself and ask the authors, right, with your annotations, whether or not our current approaches really help people successfully reintegrate in society, or whether sometimes we create new obstacles that actually make success more difficult. And maybe we make those obstacles on purpose. Let's figure, be curious, ask those questions. All right, well, I look forward to talking with you in Module 3. Enjoy.